So Ecclesiastes 1:12. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow, the more knowledge, the more grief. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun.
Well, good evening and welcome to our Jesus In series, where we're looking at 3 books from the Old Testament and Jesus as foreshadowed there. Next Sunday, we're looking at Jesus in the book of Esther. Last Sunday, we looked at Jesus in the book of Proverbs. And tonight, we're looking at Jesus in Ecclesiastes. This afternoon, you might know that thousands of people gathered at the Adelaide Oval to remember, during the time what would have been an AFL game that was cancelled, to remember Phil Walsh. Did you wake up on Friday morning to hear the shocking news of the death of Phil Walsh in a tragic set of family circumstances? His life cut short, a potential next stage of his AFL coaching career suddenly snuffed out. How did that make you feel on Friday? Did it get you reflecting upon your life and the activities of your life? This is a fairly well-known, a famous couple. It's Maria von Wedemeyer and her fiancé Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They were engaged to be married during World War II. They were a German couple, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian pastor. He was arrested by the Nazi secret police, and put in jail for opposing the rule of Adolf Hitler. And just 1 month before the fall of Nazi Germany, the end of World War II, the Nazi secret police murdered him. And that marriage that held so much potential never happened. Now, you could tell me other stories that you know from life where potential has been cut short. Stories like Phil Walsh, stories like this one. And this theme is how the book of Ecclesiastes opens in its first section. It talks about things going round and round. It says, generations come and generations go. And the generations that are to come will not remember the vast majority of the activities of the generations that have come before. How does that make you feel? All the things that we pour our life into. That the generations, if the world continues, the generations that are to come will remember almost nothing of what we have done. How do you respond to that? Well, some people respond by, I suppose, encapsulating their thoughts and feelings in a bit of humour. One person said, "Life is short, so eat the dessert first." Another person said, "Life is short, so go ahead, buy the shoes." Another person said, "Life is short, smile while you still have teeth." It's funny because it's actually quite serious, isn't it? That is how we feel about life. The generations come, says Ecclesiastes, and the generations go. And those that are to come will remember very little of those that were before. How do you feel about that? What would you say about that? More importantly, what does Jesus say about that? In Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, he says to those who are listening and to us today, he says, "Do not store up treasures on earth. Do not act as if this world and its activities are all that exists, that all that is. Do not store up wealth in this world as if there is nothing beyond that." No, Jesus says, be conscious of God. Centre your life on God. He says, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Another way of speaking about centering your life on God. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. These two fundamentally different ways of living life. Living as if this world and all of its activities are all that exists. And the other alternative of recognising that God is there and our lives are meant to be centred on Him. Jesus brings home at the climax of the Sermon on the Mount these two different choices by telling a story. He tells the story of a man building a house. He says, if you listen to his words, you are like a wise man who dug down through the soil until he hit rock, and then he built the foundations of his house on that rock. And when the winds came and the storm and the rain blew against that house, it did not fall. But those of us, Jesus says, who hear his words but do not listen to him, who live as if this world is all that is, we're like a man who built his house straight on the soil, on the sand, without any foundation. The winds blew and beat against that house, and Jesus says it fell with a mighty crash. Jesus puts before us in the Sermon on the Mount the same two roads, the same two choices that the wisdom books in the Old Testament, like Proverbs last week, Ecclesiastes tonight, put before us: the path of wisdom and the path of foolishness. The generations come and the generations go. How does that make you feel? What does the teacher in Ecclesiastes have to say about that? And who is this person, this teacher in Ecclesiastes? Well, the opening verse tells us who he is. It tells us in chapter 1, verse 1, that these are the words of the teacher. He has wisdom to pass on to us, and he is somebody with power and authority. He is a son of David. He is a king in Jerusalem. Now, first words are really important, aren't they? I wonder, can you remember the first words you ever spoke to the most important person to you? If you're married, it might be your spouse. It might be your best friend. It might be somebody else. Can you remember the very first words you spoke to them? First words are important. They say a lot. What are this man's first words? This is what he says. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. These are his opening words. Meaningless. That word in English is a translation of the original Hebrew word this man would have used, which is havel. And havel means a mist, a vapour, a passing fog. It is here one moment and gone the next. If you were listening as Chanel read the Bible reading for us a moment ago, you would have noticed that the teacher, the man, says that he explored all of the possibilities to the utmost extreme of pleasure. And when he had experienced all the possible pleasures he could, he said, Havel, it is a mist, a passing vapour. He did the same with projects. He was a great builder. He planted a vineyard, put up palaces, put up a reservoir. And after all of his great projects, he says in the end, Havel, it is a passing mist, a vapour, here today and gone tomorrow. When we hear this man, this teacher, this son of David, king in Jerusalem, there's one particular king that we are meant to bring to mind, Solomon. Solomon, son of David, great king of Israel, the one who ruled Israel at its pinnacle, at its greatest moment, when it had its greatest wealth and glory. And Solomon had great wisdom, such great wisdom it has been recorded and passed down to us permanently in the Bible, in the book of Proverbs. But Solomon not only had great wisdom that he used in his exploration here in the book of Ecclesiastes, as he explores the possibility of finding meaning in pleasure and meaning in work and activity. That's not the only thing we need to remember about him. We need to remember how his story ends. For 1 Kings tells us this is how his story ends. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. So what was the end then of Solomon's search? Using his wisdom, going down the path, seeking meaning in pleasure, seeking meaning in projects. Was the end result, was his legacy something lasting, something on a solid foundation? Or did the word of the teacher, Havel, a passing mist, apply to his works? Well, he tells us. He tells us, I said to myself, look, I've increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. He had great wisdom and power and wealth that he as king of Israel could use in his search to the uttermost end of pleasure, to the uttermost end of projects. And what does he say was the end result? Was it something concrete and lasting? This is what he says. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was Havel. It was a mist. It was a passing vapour, a fog that was here one moment and gone the next, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Are you prepared to hear him? Because he's not only speaking about himself, about his search for meaning in pleasure and in projects. He's saying the same about us. When we seek meaning in pleasure and projects, he says it is not found there. It is a passing vapour. How are you responding to that right now? Some of us might respond with the half glass full response and say, well, maybe it's not quite that bad. Maybe there is some meaning found in pleasure and projects. Others of us might say, you know, he's right. And because he's right, I might as well eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. See, this man, this teacher, is really doing us a favour. He is facing us, helping us face the reality that we will not find meaning in these places. He does it in a very personal way in chapter 6 when he says, everyone's toil is for their mouth, yet their appetite is never satisfied. This too is meaningless, a passing fog, a chasing after the wind. So here in the book of Ecclesiastes, the teacher is helping us face something we all suspect is true. We all experience, don't we, the disappointments of life. Some of us feel it more than others. And this man, through whom we are meant to think of King Solomon, he is saying to us, with all of my prestige and all of my wealth and all of my power as a king, an emperor over a great empire, I pursued pleasure to the utmost extreme. And when I got to the utmost extreme, beyond which any of us will ever go, I found meaning was not found there. Not meaning for life. It was a mist, chavel, a passing fog. When I used my wealth and power and prestige to find meaning and purpose for life in my great projects, greater projects than any of you will ever work at, I got to the end of them and I found meaning and purpose was not there. It was chavel, it was a passing fog. It was here today and gone tomorrow. And he even says the same about that very wisdom that God had given him. Meaning and purpose for life was not even found in that wisdom. He says in chapter 8, verse 17, no one can comprehend with wisdom what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as he sat in that Nazi jail cell, I'm sure he must have understood it was highly likely that he would not get out of there alive, and he and his beloved Maria would not be able to marry. He was asked to write, of all things, a wedding sermon, which he sent to his niece. And as he wrote this wedding sermon, he reflected on this reality that we find in the book of Ecclesiastes. He said, since people live on earth, God has given them a lasting reminder that this earth stands under the curse of sin and is not itself the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality, meaning and purpose for our life cannot be found in pleasures and in projects of life. So where then is meaning found? Well, the teacher tells us in the last chapter, in chapter 12. He says, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Meaning, purpose for life is found in God himself, not in the pleasures of life, not in the projects of life. In a little while, the band's going to come up here and they're going to join us for the last song. And they're going to sing to us, or sing with us, a song that we're going to sing to God. And we're going to say to God in that song, only you can satisfy. Only God can satisfy. Isn't that the message we see through Solomon here? The figure of Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. He says to us, with all of the power and wealth and prestige that was at his disposal, he pursued pleasure to the utmost extreme, beyond any lengths that you and I could go. And he said, when I got to the very end of it, meaning was not there. Purpose for life was not there. It was chavel in his language, a fog, a passing mist. And he said, I pursued projects to the utmost extreme. Greater projects than you and I will ever be involved in. Chavel, he said, it is a passing mist. It drives us to the reality, as we will sing in our last song. Only God can satisfy. But we might ask, how? How does God satisfy? God satisfies us with himself. As the prophet Isaiah said, looking forward to Jesus, he said, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, rest on Jesus, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. How does God in Jesus provide us with this wisdom that gives us true meaning and purpose for our lives? Well, as we've been seeing in this series, it is found at the cross, in the cross of Jesus. How is it found at the cross? What does Paul say to the Corinthians? It is because of him, because of Jesus, that you're in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. 3 big words, but they actually mean something quite straightforward, something very important, but not that hard to understand. You see, you and I stand guilty before God. We sense that, don't we? That none of us can actually keep God's requirements. But Jesus at the cross steps in for us and takes all of our guilt upon himself And so when we look to God through the cross, God declares us not guilty. It's entirely something God does. It doesn't depend on us, it depends entirely on Jesus. That's what happens at the cross for us. We might look at ourselves sometimes and wonder, why would God want someone like me? Well, God, again, acts entirely in and of himself. And at the cross, if we look to him, he sets us apart and makes us his. That's what that word holiness means. He sets us apart and makes us his. Again, something God himself entirely does. This rescue, this redemption is entirely an action of God done at the cross. See, when we look to God through the cross, there we find true meaning and purpose for our lives. We know that we are loved by God, that we belong to him, and nobody can take that away from us. So you can see, can't you, why Jesus says, don't think that this life is all that there is and pile up riches as if life isn't going to end, as if meaning and purpose is simply found in the pleasure and activity of this life. No, be like the wise man who dug down through the soil and laid the foundations of his house on the rock. Recognise that true meaning, true purpose for life is found in knowing God through the message of the cross. For Jesus himself later on in Matthew's Gospel makes it clear that the message of Ecclesiastes is true. This world is passing away, but my word, says Jesus, will never pass away. Therefore, true meaning, true purpose in life is found in knowing God. Only you, God, will satisfy. And when we know that's true, it gives us a right perspective on our time, our short time in this world. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, the man who sat in that prison cell, pretty certain that the secret police would eventually take his life. Earthly society, he said, is only the beginning of the heavenly society. The earthly home, an image of the heavenly home. So how then does the teacher in Ecclesiastes end his message? Well, in chapter 12, he says to us, remember. Remember your Creator, he says, in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and I say to myself, I find no pleasure in them. And there he pictures our life, each of our lives, in a number of powerful pictures. Something, I suppose, like a house that's gradually falling down. You know, the tiles are gradually falling off. The windows are creaking open. The hinges are coming undone and the doors are falling off. The floorboards are coming up. And he's saying to us, wherever we see ourselves in the stages of that house that's gradually falling down, he says, remember your Creator. And especially remember your Creator before the Phil Walsh moment comes for us. Phil Walsh, 55 years of age, at a next stage of his great career as a coach, suddenly he's gone. And the writer of Ecclesiastes says, remember your Creator before the silver cord of life is cut through, before that golden bowl of life is cracked and is no more, before the water of life at the well is smashed and is no more. Remember your Creator, he says. The New Testament says, the Gospel says, remember your Creator by coming to him through the message of the cross and having that great security of knowing that you belong to God, that you are his, that you are known by him in this world, and nothing and nobody can take that away from you. You see, friends, when we do that, when we respond to the message of Ecclesiastes in this way, interestingly, it actually changes our perspective on the pleasures and projects of this world. If you've never read the book of Ecclesiastes, I encourage you to go home and do it. And another thing you will notice in the message is this, that when we lift off the pleasures and projects of this world, the weight it cannot bear, which is giving us meaning and purpose in life, because we find our meaning and purpose in knowing God, we can actually enjoy them. We can enjoy the legitimate pleasures that we might engage in this world. And we can enjoy to some extent the work that we're involved in, because we're not asking it to give us meaning and purpose in life, for we have found it in God. The God who has come in Jesus. The God who has come in Jesus and has brought us home to himself. I'm going to invite the band to come forward now, and they're going to lead us in song, in this song, as we sing together to God, Only You Can Satisfy. They're going to lead us in prayer, and as they do, I just ask you to reflect on this for a few moments before we pray. And ask yourself, how might this perspective change your life in the coming week? How might this change the way you approach pleasure and projects, whether at work or study, this coming week? Realising that your meaning for life, your purpose for life, is found in knowing God through the message of the cross.